When flood evacuees arrive in Hudson, Amy works with a frightened horse in Heartland season 16 episode 5. Jack and Lisa assist a young couple, Tim bonds with an evacuee, and Rick fills in for Lou. The first scene of the show included Scott and a few other guys harnessing a horse and using a helicopter to hoist it out of a flood zone. It was quite the sight. But even while it might have looked extremely spectacular, Biscuit, the horse, didn't much enjoy it. Even though Amy was on hand to soothe the horse once it touched down in Hudson and transport it back to the ranch, Biscuit was not faring well. He was anxious and hostile. He ought to be after what he just experienced. Amy was able to settle Biscuit in the stable so the horse could rest and recover with the aid of Jack and Tim. Biscuit owners Emily and David Carpenter also arrived at the ranch later in the day. The horse was closest to Emily, but even she couldn't calm Biscuit down. After having time to rest, Biscuit appeared more at ease the following morning. It also helped that Emily, his owner, was a better person. But Biscuit had not yet fully recovered. Amy had a hunch that the helicopter strap may have caused Biscuit some minor injuries, in addition to scaring him. So she made the decision to move slowly with Biscuit. The horse's condition was also quickly getting better, especially after Biscuit met Georgie's dog Remy, who seemed to have a similar personality to Winston, the carpenter's dog who had been lost in the flood. By the end of the episode, Biscuit was not only back to normal, but Scott had also located Winston and brought him to Heartland so that the horse and dog could be back together. However, Biscuit's owners also had to choose their next steps after having to recover from the trauma brought on by the flash flood. At the property, Emily and David were very upset when they arrived. However, the generosity of the Bartlett family, including Tim's giving up of his loft so Emily could be nearer to Biscuit, gave them cause for optimism. The following day, when David was permitted to return to their farm and evaluate the situation, that hope was dashed. And his discovery was not good. In addition to losing their home, the water likely also dragged up toxins from nearby properties, raising the possibility that their sustainable organic farm might no longer qualify as organic, in which case recovering it would be extremely difficult. They would also need to start from scratch because the crops were wrecked underwater in addition to everything else. On their property, the barn was the only object that was still standing. That gave David no chance. He was prepared to accept Lisa's offer to hire him and Emily to work for her at Fairfield Stables since he was unable to see any other options. But Emily was more upbeat. Emily was prepared to work hard and rebuild. She had to persuade her spouse to agree to it first, though. And it wasn't simple. Living in the country, working for themselves, and creating something of their own were all reasons why they left the city and began their farm, and she tried to explain to David how working at Fairfield would go against all of those reasons. However, Lisa was ultimately able to persuade David due to her perception of the life the Bartlett family had created for themselves at the ranch, as well as other factors. Winston's owners and himself were so eventually reconciled as a result of Scott. Emily and David stated at the dinner table that they were going to rebuild their farm after all, and Biscuit felt better too. While they rebuild their own home, the pair will reside at their neighbor's home. Additionally, they were considering building their own barn loft because their barn was the only structure that survived the flood. Intriguingly, on Heartland season 16 episode 5, Jack and Lisa were able to resolve their relationship issues thanks to David and Emily's predicaments. In the last episode, Lisa came home after a prolonged absence, making Jack a content cowboy. However, in this episode, Lisa was probably called away once more by her work. Chuck, Lisa's trainer, texted her to say that he had located a horse that Lisa should fly to Florida to view in a few days. Naturally, Jack was not delighted about this. His wife had just returned from the road and was about to do so once more. As a result, the two spent some time avoiding one another. The Dude Ranch was set up for the flood evacuees, who were given food and any other necessities by Lisa, who threw herself into the effort. But it was clear that she was using it as a diversion from resolving her own interpersonal problems. So, when Jack rejected Lisa's offer to hire David and Emily at her company after dinner and Jack disagreed, their emotions came to a head and they began to argue. Jack may not have liked Lisa's offer to David and Emily to work for her while they figure out their situation at first, but that argument quickly evolved into what it was really about. Jack was trying to support Lisa's dreams but failing to do so by, understandably, not wanting her to go to Florida so soon after she got back. Fortunately, the two talked it out the following morning, acknowledged their mistakes, and reconciled. The horse was sold to someone else, so Lisa didn't have to travel to Florida after all. However, the next time that occurs, it might be easier on their relationship because Lisa will know for sure that Jack does support her, he just prefers to be with her. Speaking of helping the evacuees, Lisa swiftly convinced Tim to lend a hand because David and Emily were living at the barn loft while Tim was temporarily staying at the Dude Ranch. The same Dude Ranch where some of the evacuees were staying. At first, Tim only offered assistance by putting the evacuees up in their cabins, distributing food, and doing everything else he could. However, as Tim was distributing coffee, he caught sight of an elderly man who was remaining silent and refusing any of the food or coffee that was being served. Henry Gunderson acted rudely toward Tim when Tim approached him and told him he didn't want his donation. Tim backed off a little after hearing this, but he also seemed to see something in the older man that inspired Tim to try again later. The following morning Tim approached Henry, introduced himself, and once more offered to contact a person who knew Henry. And while it didn't change Henry's opinion of Tim, Henry still believed Tim was playing the role of the rescuer, it did cause Henry to be a little more open with Tim. Henry revealed to Tim that he had lost his farm in the flood, that he was now a recluse with his son, and that he lived alone after his wife passed away a few years prior. Henry was just accepting the awful reality of the situation despite how sad it was. Tim saw a strong resonance in Henry's separation from his child. In addition, Tim has a son named Shane who he hasn't seen in a long time. Tim therefore made the decision to find Henry's son, Kyle, without Henry's knowledge, despite Henry telling Tim that he didn't want anything to do with his kid because he didn't even come home when Henry's wife got sick. Thus, Kyle and Henry were reunited at the end of the episode. Tim decided to contact his own son after this meeting. Shane is currently working as a law clerk for a Philadelphia-based company, it turns out. Tim wanted to meet Shane because he will be in New York shortly with Jessica for her art exhibition. Philly isn't that far away from New York City, after all. This reunion will probably be included in the upcoming episode, which is really exciting. Shane was last spotted way back in season 6. But will there be joy at the reunion? We'll have to see the upcoming show to find out, I suppose. Finally, Rick truly came through for Lou in this episode, and he handled the flood evacuee issue like a pro. Rick has stepped up and covered for Lou in a variety of roles during this season, including attending events and substituting for Lou at meetings. This was completely different, though, as Rick had to face a real issue and make judgments. Lou wasn't opposed to being there, she simply couldn't since Georgie was in the hospital, and Rick recognized that. But the unexpected situation he found himself in was still making him anxious and agitated. Additionally, he and his girlfriend were going through the adoption process, which involved a lot of paperwork on top of everything else. Fortunately, Rick received assistance from Lou's family. Katie started by reaching out to friends and encouraging Hudson residents to take in some of the flood evacuees. It wasn't enough, though, so Lou got a hold of a video crew so Rick could make an on-air appeal for assistance the following day. Rick will naturally have to deliver a speech in front of a large audience while it is live. When Parker heard this and saw how nervous Rick was, he asked Tim for his assistance in teaching Rick because Tim had given speeches before while Rick had not. So, the two spent the entire morning working on it, and when Rick finally had to deliver the speech that afternoon, he did so flawlessly. Lou even gave Rick a call to thank him for a job well done. Rick was once more there to assist Lou, Hudson, and anyone else who required assistance. Is Rick being set up to become Hudson's next mayor by all of this? Most likely not. But I have to admit, I think he'd be fantastic at it. And given that Lou's mayoral term or the mayoral election has been referenced several times already this season, I believe that they may be gradually setting up a mayoral election later in the season.